Hello, and welcome to a presentation from Carleton University School of Journalism and Communications. My name is Nanaba Duncan, and I'm an associate professor here. I'm also the Carty Chair in Journalism, Diversity, and Inclusion Studies. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge the land I'm on. I was born on a different land in Accra, Ghana, and I'm born of two tribes, the Fanti tribe, who are the people who live by the water, my father's side, and the Akwapim tribe. My mother's people, the ones who lived in the mountains. My parents brought me to Turtle Island when I was very young, and I know what it's like to feel connected to a land and its people. And so I'm honored to recognize this land that I'm on right now and its people. I stand on the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. I've got a lot to learn about the Algonquin Nation, and I consider it my responsibility to take steps to do so. And I encourage others to be aware of the territory that they live and work on. And so I'm also very glad to be presenting my colleague and friend, Duncan McCue. You may know him as an award-winning CBC journalist, and he is. Duncan is Anishinaabe. He is from a member of the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation. And he's been here as a visiting fellow this week. He's been at a couple of classes, including my journalism and belonging class. He's been talking to faculty members. And today he's here, or right now, he's here with you to do a presentation on how we can rethink reporting on Indigenous trauma. Duncan, welcome.
Hi, Ani.
And I know you've got a presentation for us today. I want to invite everyone who's got a question to put it in the Q&A. At the bottom right of this screen, you'll see two speech bubbles, and underneath the letters Q and A, you click that and you'll be guided to put your question there. So after Duncan has done his presentation, I will relay some of those questions to him, and we'll take it from there. Duncan, the floor is yours.
Miigwech nanaba, nichikuan nanaba, Ani kinawea, onkadons Indigenous kas, maingan nedo dem Chippewas Georgina Island and Duan Chippa, and Anishinaabe and Dao, Gimino Gijagak Mompi Ottawa ing. It is a beautiful day here in Ottawa, and I'm so happy to see. Well, I can't see you all, but I'm so happy that all of you could join us. I wish you could join us in real life, but the good news about this is we can reach people from all over the place. So, miigwech, thank you to everyone who's joined us today. I want to thank Carleton for inviting me to be a visiting fellow this week, and to be able to share some thoughts on Indigenous journalism with the students here at Carleton. Alan Thompson, who is the chair of the program here, asked me to do a public talk and asked me what I wanted to talk about. And the thing that jumped into my mind was a problem that we've had for a long time in journalism, and that's what I want to talk about today. The name of the talk is Rethinking, covering reporting on Indigenous trauma. Let me start here. I'll hang on. I'll get my screen sharing thing going here. Can you all see that? I hope so. Give me a thumbs up if you can, just to make sure. When
Yep.
The problem that we have, I say we as journalists have had for a really long time now, is a trust problem. It's a trust gap between journalists and the Indigenous communities that we cover. And that problem, I've been a journalist for a couple decades now, and that problem, that trust gap, is something that has troubled me for a really long time. And about a decade ago, I sat down to put together a guide to assist reporters on give them some tips on how to do a better job in reporting in Indigenous communities. And at that time, 10 years ago, I thought that one of the things the reason we were facing this trust problem, when we went into communities, asked them to tell their stories, I thought that it had to do with a long colonial history. I thought that it had to do with the fact that Indigenous communities have had outsiders coming into their communities and asking to take things away for a really long time. Whether it is stories, whether it is art, whether it is children, whether it is bones, whether it is DNA, whether it is information, whether it is resources, whether it's land. Outsiders have been coming to Indigenous communities for since the beginning of this country, and asking for things, taking them away, and often without the consent of Indigenous communities, and often not doing any work to ensure that Indigenous communities had any say whatsoever in the product of what it was that they were taking away. And I realized that journalists are no different. That if perhaps one of the reasons that Indigenous communities don't trust us is because we go into communities and we ask them to share their story, whatever their story may be, the important news of the day that we're covering. We stick a microphone in their face and say, how does it feel? We gather information and stories from them, and then we take it away and we edit it in a suite somewhere in some city in Canada, and then we put it on the news, and then we move on to the next news story. And so at that time, 10 years ago, when I put together the guide that you see up in the corner there, RIIC.ca, reporting in Indigenous communities, I tried to express it as the problem of being, whether we as journalists are storytellers or story takers. And in fact, that's what we are. If you're not offering Indigenous communities a veto over the draft version of your script, for example, then you are, in fact, a story taker. I, as an Indigenous journalist, am a story taker. And so I tried to articulate the problem that way. One thing that I don't have in the guide, I still think that's a valid observation to make, and something that all journalists need to be aware of, is this long history of taking away from extractive journalism is a big problem, and we need to be able to balance that. And the guide was designed to try to give some tips to people on how they can balance and not be story takers, but be more like storytellers. One thing I don't have in the guide, though, which I wrote a decade ago, was a chapter on trauma-informed journalism. A blind spot of mine, perhaps. But I think also a decade ago, we weren't necessarily talking as much about trauma-informed journalism. We were talking about trauma-informed journalism in the context of war. And so the DART Center for Trauma-Informed Journalism has done amazing work in terms of covering wars, covering major tragedies. And so there's that work has been done. And I give an absolute nod to the DART Center for the amazing work that they have done. But we weren't, thinking necessarily about covering Indigenous communities and aspects of trauma and how that was impacting our work. I'm also not a psychologist, and I'm not a mental health expert, and that's another reason why that wasn't a chapter in the guide. Not many journalists are, and we learn through a process of trial and error, in a large part, how to deal with trauma. We are often sent on a daily basis to cover stories where people have experienced trauma, but very, very rarely are we given training on how to deal with that, to deal with those difficult circumstances. Again, we all develop through a process of trial and error ways to cope with covering death and covering tragedy, but very rarely have we trained. And so for me, a lot of it was learning on the ground. But I've also been influenced in the past couple of years by other Indigenous journalists who, I think, like me, were instinctively starting to incorporate and adjust and adapt our journalism practice in ways that fit with our cultural sensibilities. And so I think of a large number of Indigenous journalists over the past couple of years who have really started to push back against some of the norms. And so I'm thinking of Connie Walker, of Tanya Talaga, of Angela Starrett, Brandy Moran, of the great team at Indigenous in British Columbia, Martha Troyan. By naming names, I risk forgetting them. And so there are many, and almost all, they're all Indigenous women journalists. I'll point that out. But many of them are starting to bring into practice trauma-informed principles guided by their Indigenous cultural sensibilities and adapting their journalism practice. And this is why I called this talk Rethinking Reporting on Indigenous Trauma, because I think this is something which is starting to evolve and needs to be incorporated into the mainstream reporting practices. So that's what I want to talk about. But before I get into the depth of talk, I just want to tell you a story, just because that's what I do, tell stories. So about 5 or 6 years ago, I had been, there was an intense amount of interest and appetite, finally, for stories on missing and murdered Indigenous women. And after doing several stories, along with a dedicated team at CBC and CBC Indigenous, on missing and murdered Indigenous women, it occurred to me that many of the stories I was hearing from women, Indigenous women, were about experiencing abuse at the hands of Indigenous men. And I thought to myself, that was something that was being underreported, was what are we doing to help Indigenous men with the problem of domestic abuse in our communities? And so I knew of a small group in the East End of Vancouver called Warriors Against Violence, the Warriors Against Violence Society. That's what you see on the screen there, who were doing some amazing work working with men and trying to heal men from the challenges they were facing with regard to their family life and their relationships with their partners and being abusive. I thought that would make a good story, and CBC was interested in it, and so they said, sure, go ahead. And the challenge for me was a number of things. I knew I would be dealing with incredibly traumatic stories, and how would I get access and be able to tell those stories in a safe way and in a way that that also helped people understand the work that this group was doing. So without a camera, I went and dropped in on Joe and Joyce Vasella, who are the people that the married couple that run the group, started the group, and I explained to them what I wanted to do and who I was and where I was from and what my goals were for the project. And they listened very kindly and said, yeah, we'd be interested, but I think it'd be important that you explain to the men what it is that you are hoping to do. So we had a good first meeting, and they invited me back to a second meeting. Without a camera. I'm a TV reporter, so the fact that none of this happened on camera, it means that it didn't happen, basically. But I went back for a second meeting with the group, the full group of men who were going to the circle, Warriors Against Violence circle. And again, I explained who I was, where I was from, what I was hoping to do, what my goals for the project were, that I was a television reporter and that I would have cameras here and that I needed to be able to show them as they were sharing their stories. And I invited them to ask any questions and to share any concerns. And we had a big, long conversation. And at that time, there was some interest and also some reservations, but we talked about them and came up with a strategy that felt comfortable for the group and also felt comfortable for me as a television reporter. And they said, yes, let's do this, let's go ahead. So they invited us, and we ended up going to 3 different circles with our cameras and filming the full sessions of healing circles with the Warriors Against Violence Society. We told the men who were all showing up what we were doing, explained to them where the content would be going, invited them if they didn't want to participate, if they didn't want to be seen on screen, that we could sit them in certain parts of the circle and we would make sure that we wouldn't include them. Listen to each of the men and their concerns before we ever began rolling. And then for 3 separate sessions, we proceeded to film the circle. I'm going to play you a video of that. It's just a brief section from that documentary and a trigger alert if there's some difficult material in this 2 minutes talking about domestic abuse. So you may want to mute yourself if you have any concerns about that.
Watching my mom getting beat by my father on a regular basis. Seeing my 8-year-old sister in bed with my father, naked, when I was about 14. Watching my dad almost kill my 8-year-old sister when she was 4 years old. Choking her, swinging her around until she pooped herself. She almost died. That's trauma.
all the negativity was started to build on me and stuff like that, and it got worse where my dad he hit me a few times, and I took it very hard. I soiled myself when he hit me. I was that scared.
I never saw the same woman ever at my house with my dad more than 3 times. So that other learned behavior. I learned to use and abuse women.
I grew up with violence in my neighborhood and school and just the way things were growing up on the res.
Watched my stepfather, beat the shit out of me, beat my mother up, beat everybody else up. All the older guys womanizing and, sneaking into beds and fooling around with each other's wives and stuff like that. I didn't think 2 things of it.
I witnessed my first murder at the age of 4, and I was first sexually abused at the age of 5. Growing up, that seemed to be the norm where I'm from.
Because I feel each and every one of these stories about their abuse, controlling. Oh, it wasn't my fault. That's a bunch of baloney. We knew what we were doing because we were taught how to do it. So we have no excuses. We cannot blame nobody except ourselves. And that's why I say today, from my day forward, I'm still that angry child from residential school, from growing up from an abusive home. I'm still that angry person. But except I learned to work with in a better way to get back to people.
So, still, those men are brave. They were brave to share that stuff in the circle. They were brave, even braver so, to share it with me, knowing that this was going to be shown on national television. And you may ask yourself why? Why did they want to do it? To a man, they all said that they hoped that if this was one small way of giving back, that if they could share with other families that it was possible to heal, that there were steps toward healing, that would be their contribution. I did not have any worries the night before this piece went to air about concerns about the group and their concern and how they would feel about this piece, because I knew that I had been as open as I could be about what we were trying to do and what form it would take. I will say that afterwards, after the piece aired, that the group Warriors Against Violence was very pleased with the end product, and that's always a good thing. It's not the only goal when we do journalism, but I was happy that they were happy. But a couple of things happened after that. The piece aired, and then a couple of weeks later, I went to a sweat lodge with the group Warriors Against Violence. This is something that I had, one of the commitments that I made to them, that after the story, not before the story, but after the story, that I would absolutely come and share and sit down with the brothers in a lodge so that A, they could give me feedback, and B, I could sit in the circle with them again and share our experience and our feelings together. They invited me and asked me to do that, and I said, after I'm finished my story, I will absolutely do that. There were we talked about the story and how they felt about it and the impacts that it had on them. And then several months later, when at the end of their summer solstice ceremony, where they have a big feast, they invited me back again just to close out the year and to share it as part of their year, the fact that they had had a CBC reporter drop in and visit them and tell their story. And I absolutely went to that feast long after the story was on the air. And I say that because I think, in my experience in this story with Warriors Against Violence, the question is not so much to ask yourself, what is it that I'm trying to get out of this? What am I trying to get access to? But what am I giving back to the community? And the ongoing relationship, the accountability aspect of it, is as much a part of your relationship, not acting in an extractive manner, as much as possible. So I raised that just because I wanted to give you a real life version of covering trauma and what that's like, and some of the approaches that I've had in my real life. But I just want to walk you through a couple of, if I can, don't play this, oops. Walk you through, I think what the essence of my talk is going to be, that rethinking the covering of Indigenous trauma means two things. It means taking care of your subjects, and it means taking care of yourself. So I'm going to talk about taking care of your subjects first, and then I'll get on to taking care of yourself. When my friend and colleague, former CBC colleague, but now working at Gimlet, Connie Walker, the work that she has done with her podcasts has been an immeasurable contribution in terms of getting this conversation going with regard to trauma-informed journalism in Indigenous communities. And Connie had something super smart to say, and I'm just going to read it out. I don't want to leave people in a worse situation. When you're dealing with Indigenous communities, trauma is interwoven into so many aspects of life. You have to be careful and respectful of how that impacts people. And I want to hone in on something that Connie said there, that trauma is interwoven into so many aspects of life. If you are a daily news reporter, if you'll absolutely come into contact with trauma. If you're covering Indigenous communities, trauma, whether it is car crashes or fires or accidents or domestic abuse or crime, poverty, Indigenous people in this country suffer trauma at disproportionate amounts to the rest of Canadians. And so you will encounter trauma if you're assigned to reporting in Indigenous communities. To put a stat to it, Indigenous people are about 4 times the risk of severe trauma than the rest of the population. Some studies have showed, and there's the study cited at the bottom of the screen there if you're interested. So absolutely, if you're a news reporter, you're going to come into contact with trauma. There's no doubt about it. But there's also a historical trauma. All Indigenous people, I would argue, have suffered some sort of trauma in their life. And so even if you're an arts reporter, if you're a sports reporter, if you are a business reporter, you may not be rushing off to cover tragedies, but you are going to encounter Indigenous subjects who have experienced trauma. And the way that I like the way that Wabgijig Rice, my former CBC colleague and now an author, expressed this in his book Moon and the Crusted Snow. Yes, Apocalypse, one of his characters said, we've had that over and over and over, but we always survived. We're still here. Wabgijig was talking about apocalypse and what Indigenous peoples all over Turtle Island have experienced, which has been, everything from biological warfare to land dispossession to stolen children to family disruptions to cultural genocide to genocide. If you think of every Indigenous person that you encounter as being a post-apocalyptic survivor, then it begins to give you a sense of some of the challenges that you will have when you start to ask difficult questions about their past. And I think it's important then, when we talk about interviewing Indigenous subjects, instead of just sticking our microphones into their face and saying, how do you feel? I think it's important to start thinking about centering and caring for our subjects when we are aware and recognize that we will be dealing with traumatic subjects, traumatic issues, traumatic subject matter. So I'm going to run through, as quickly as I can, a few tips in terms of caring for your subjects. Center, and again, I'm not a mental health expert, and I've leaned heavily on work that's been done by the DART Center, and also Joe Healy has written an amazing book called Trauma Reporting, which I've merely just kind of tried to put it in an Indigenous context. But let me run through a couple of tips that I've gotten from that. Be humble. When you go in to ask an Indigenous subject about something that may be traumatic, it's not always easy for reporters to do. We're not necessarily a humble bunch, journalists, but certainly in an Anishinaabe communities, in our worldview, humility is an essential. It's one of our grandfather teachings. And just remember this, when I say humility, what I'm saying is people who have experienced trauma, they don't owe us their stories. Just because we're asking for their stories, because we happen to think on this particular news day that their story is important, they don't owe those stories to us. It is a privilege. It is a privilege to have someone share a story of a traumatic experience with us. And we need to remember that. We need to be humble about what we're doing and to be aware that it is a privilege to be tasked with the role and the job of sharing someone's story of trauma. And so I would urge you to try to be humble and be human when you're dealing with people who have experienced trauma. Be transparent. When I talked about the Warriors Against Violence coverage that I did, transparency was a big part of it. Most people aren't accustomed to having journalists in their lives. They don't understand how we work. They don't understand the difference between radio reporting and TV reporting, print and digital, and so we need to make sure that they understand what it is we're doing, why we're doing it, how their stories, that when we take a picture that it may end up on the internet and that it will be there forever. When we stick a microphone in their face that we're recording and that we may be quoting them, we need to be 100% transparent. Sometimes journalists don't do that. Sometimes because of the deadline pressure that we're under, we don't feel like we have the time to explain to everybody. Sometimes we're so wrapped up in trying to get real people to talk about the trauma that they experience that when we finally get somebody, we don't want to risk it. We don't want to lose these people, and we worry that if we explain everything about what we're doing, that they may say no. I would argue that we need to do that. We need to explain to them what it is that we're engaged in, so that they understand. And so it goes to the next point, so that they have full consent to being involved in what it is that the project is that you're involved in. This notion of an informed consent, I don't think it's a static thing. And I think when you're dealing with vulnerable people and people who have experienced trauma, I think that you need to have informed consent at the beginning of the process, but then during the interview and after the interview and before your story goes to air or is printed. I think there are several points along the journey, the reporting journey, where you need to check back in and see how people are feeling and be prepared for adjustments. We owe that to survivors of trauma to ensure that we're not inflicting more harm upon them. As Connie said, we don't want to inflict more harm upon people that have already experienced trauma. Unwittingly, perhaps, but that doesn't mean that we can't make efforts to ensure that we are minimizing the harm that they may be experiencing by sharing their stories. Recognize that it's important to empower your Indigenous interviewees who have experienced trauma, because one of the things that they've experienced is that they've lost control. And you need to give them some of that power back and return some of that control to them. And so as a TV reporter, I'm very conscious of light and sound and wanting to be in the best setting, and the schedule that I'm on. I'm only available between 1 and 3, and oh no, can we shoot it inside rather than outside? Because I don't want to, I'm worried about the truck sound. There are all kinds of technical reasons that we worry about those kinds of things, but I would urge you to do your best to try to center your Indigenous interviewee and where they feel comfortable, where they feel safe, where they feel that this is the best place for them and the best time for them to be sharing those traumatic stories. That gives them a measure of control over sharing of their story, and it may mean that you need to make some changes to the way that you're approaching things technically, but it's important that your Indigenous subject feels a sense of control over the interview. Remember resilience. And resilience, that word gets overused a lot. I prefer the word survivance, which Anishinaabe philosopher and writer Gerald Visner came up with. But the point being that, Indigenous subjects may have experienced trauma, but they are more than their trauma. Indigenous trauma should not be your lead. Billy Ray Belcourt wrote when he was being covered as a poet, and I think that was a good way of expressing it. We need to not look. Yes, people may have experienced traumatic events, and yes, that may be very critical to your story, but also ask them questions about the hope and the joy and the optimism and the resilience in their lives, and make sure that your story reflects that. They are more than just their trauma. Remember that in your line of questioning and in the way you frame your story. And also, I'm not a therapist. I'm asking really detailed questions about people's past and often painful past. I'm not equipped as much as I would like to be to help them. After a couple decades of doing this, I do feel like the telling of the story, the sharing of the story, seeing their story affirmed in public can often be healing, but it can also be often very painful for them. And so I'm not a therapist, and in most cases, I'm gone. I'm there and I'm gone. And I have to recognize the limitations that I have as a journalist. But one thing I do think that we need to do is make sure that there's some sort of care for those people, that the fact that we're asking those questions and then we leave may trigger them, may impact them in ways that we aren't even aware of. And so we should either make sure that they have someone watching out for them in the hours and days after we visit them, but also that they do have, that there are places that they could go for counseling if our line of questioning has impacted them. And if there aren't places in many Indigenous communities, there aren't those resources, but at least make sure that there's a network there that is taking care of the person who has shared that traumatic event. I call it community care, but make sure that there's someone there other than yourself who's going to be able to watch over this person after you have picked around in their brain and asked them to tell these stories, someone who's going to be there to take care after you're gone. So that's just a rapid fire kind of just list of suggestions. And there's lots more, but it's just some tips that I have about caring for your subjects. I don't want to talk forever, and I want to have a question and answer, but I also thought, so much of trauma-informed reporting focuses on the ways that you can care for your subjects. I do think that if you're going to cover trauma in Indigenous communities, that there's a second really important prong to this, and that is caring for yourself. And I want to tell you why I make that such an important part, or I think that's an important part of this conversation. I'm going to refer here to an amazing article that my former colleague at CBC, Jody Porter, wrote in Maisonneuve magazine a couple years ago. Jody did amazing work covering First Nation communities in north of Thunder Bay in Northern Ontario, and wrote this article in Maisonneuve a couple of years ago about the challenges and the way that she was rethinking all of the tragedy that she was racing around covering in Northern Ontario, whether it was children dying in the city, whether it is racism, whether it is domestic abuse, whether it is bad water, whether it is bad housing. For years and years, as she writes in the article, she covered those stories because she hoped that bringing attention to it would bring about some change. The article was kind of a rethinking on her part of some of that tragedy coverage that she was involved in. And I want to read you this quote that she said, and it's an incredibly brave article, and I urge you to read it if you can. But she said this: "I thought my years of engaging on Indigenous issues had protected me from the white savior complex." Jody is non-Indigenous. "I'd been so good. Instead, I was blindly galloping around on my white horse, not seeing the wholeness of Indigenous lives and experience, not seeing my own brokenness. In focusing so much on the hurt in other people's lives, I'd missed the lessons that they offered about healing." It's an incredibly brave point that Jody is raised about the impact that it has on us. Vicarious trauma is real. we experience it as journalists. We're not just microphone stands. We are experiencing the stories that people share with us. And I'll share just a brief story. When I was covering the Truth and Reconciliation event in Vancouver a couple of years ago, I had pitched to the National a story, a behind-the-scenes look at the national event in Vancouver, a 4-day gathering of truth-telling. So I was racing around with the permission of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, gathering survivors' stories and just story after story of residential school survivors and the awful and the tragic and the gut-wrenching things that they experienced. I was thinking about it very much from the mindset of a journalist. Okay, we need to get that. That's a great story. There's a good clip. There's a character I should be exploring. Oh my goodness, there's we're student-on-student abuse, sexual abuse, physical language. I was being almost clinical in the way that I was building my story and hearing all of these stories just coming in at us of the immense trauma that people experienced when they went to residential school. One of the characters in the story, one of the main focal points of the story was Marie Wilson, who you see on the right of the picture there, Commissioner Marie Wilson. And at the end of one particularly long day, we were filming in her office as she debriefed with her counselors. So she had a spiritual counselor and a mental health counselor who she debriefed with at the end of every day. Because she was hearing all these stories. As a commissioner traveling across the country, she was hearing all these stories. And so they talked for a good hour about what Marie had gone through in that day and helping her unpack. And then at one point, I figured we had enough, so I turned off the camera and we sat there, we're packing up. And then at that point, Commissioner Wilson turned to me and she asked me a very simple question. She said, "How are you doing?" And I didn't have an answer for her. I hadn't stopped to think about how I was doing. I was on day 3 of covering this and hearing dozens and dozens and dozens of survivors' testimonies. And I hadn't stopped to think about how I was doing. And I didn't have an answer for her, and I kind of stumbled on something and then I left. But the next day, there were tents set up all over the national event with mental health counselors and then also traditional spiritual healers. And I went into one of the tents that was set up with a traditional spiritual healer, and I didn't say anything. I gave my camera guy a 5-minute coffee break, and I didn't say anything. And I walked in, and there was these 2 older Indigenous men there, and they just nodded at me, and I nodded at them, and they motioned me to come over, and they said, "Do you want to smudge?" And I said, "Yeah, I'd really like to smudge." And I started to smudge, and I at that point, all of those stories that I had been hearing started to move out of my brain and go to my heart. And I hadn't let that happen. Journalists do that. We all have coping mechanisms, and for me, I have a very male coping mechanism, which is just to shut down almost emotionally. But at that point, I let it connect to my heart, and I started to cry, and I couldn't stop crying. And those men, they gave me a big hug and held me for a while, and that allowed me to get through the last day of the event. But it also gave me guidance as to the hard work that we were doing in terms of sharing those stories, those survivor stories. And it all happened because Commissioner Marie Wilson asked me one very simple question: how are you doing? I think we need to ask ourselves, how are we doing? And I think our newsrooms need to ask us, how are we doing? And that doesn't happen enough when we are covering Indigenous communities. So I urge you, it is not selfish to take care of yourself, to stay healthy, whether that means eating good food. And when you're going into Indigenous communities, that's often extremely difficult to try to get good, healthy food. But do your best to take clean drinking water and protein snacks, to get sleep if you can. When we're in the field and working around the clock, it is difficult to get sleep, but you need to take care of yourself. You need to get sleep. For me, it's exercise. I need to get exercise. For me, it is going to ceremony, although that has been as difficult as possible. That's been very difficult during the pandemic, but being balanced, staying healthy is an important, critical part of doing this work. If you want to tell, there are many, many journalists out there who want to tell these stories, who want to tell about the challenges and the tragedies, and because these are important stories for Canadians to hear. And I agree with that completely. I think there needs to be a light shined in dark places in a lot of these, in a lot of our communities. But if you want to do this work, if you're committed to sharing those stories in the hopes that it will of change, you need to keep yourself healthy so that you can keep on doing this work. Develop a trauma plan. If you know that you're going to be assigned to a story that is going to contain difficult material, then you really should talk over with your team, whether it's producers or if you're a broadcaster, with your technicians, with your senior producers, senior editors. Have a trauma plan in place for what it will be like for the team in terms of the trauma that they may be experiencing when they're sent off to cover a particular event. I remember when we went to cover La Loche, the shooting in La Loche. Gosh, I wish we had a trauma plan in place, because I don't think I was ready for the how I felt a couple of days after I got back from La Loche. I'll tell you that. We didn't talk about what it was going to be like for us experiencing that, the grief that community was going through. Express yourself when you are encountering difficulties, when you are feeling overwhelmed, stressed, when you are feeling that trauma that your subjects have experienced. Then tell somebody. For me as a man, again, I find that very difficult. I tend to run into my hole. But oh my gosh, my battery is dying. Express yourself as best as you can, and make sure that you have somebody that you can talk to. Perhaps it's not a work colleague, maybe it's someone outside of work. Express gratitude. Thank your team. When we're doing this hard work, we don't often stop enough and say thank you. Thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for that hard work that you're doing. Express appreciation for the things that we put the things that we put on hold in our personal lives in order to do this important work. Acknowledge your team and say thank you. Express gratitude. Know your limits. Understand that there are times when you may need to say no. You may need to say, no, I can't go and cover missing graves. This is too triggering for me. This is not, I'm not well myself right now, and this may do harm to me. That can be difficult for younger journalists. And I want to acknowledge that. I've been around for a while, and I've got that relationship with my bosses now where I could say, yeah, no, I don't think I can take this one on right now. But for younger journalists, I recognize that's a problem, but I would urge you that if you're going to be in this for the long haul, and I hope you will be, I hope you will be able to continue to pay attention to these important stories that need to be told, then you need to make sure that you understand your limits and take care of yourself and express that to your bosses.
Hi, I wondered if that was going to happen. So guess what I did? I've let them know that I will follow up with you all. And I think he's going to run to this other computer and follow up with us there. But I do see that there are some comments here. And I have to tell you that, let's see here. Some of these questions are very, very good. I'm going to name a couple of these questions, but first I think what's standing out for me is that I'm not sure when that time was that Duncan was with the elders and had that moment with the smudging, but it's obviously still with him. It's obviously still with him. And to me, it's just a reminder that we always have to take care of ourselves, and our bodies don't always forget, you know. I'm wondering if our caretakers can let me know whether Duncan is coming back. Let's see. There he is.
And plug in your battery. They're like,
plug in your battery.
So look at me.
Right, listen, Duncan, you know what?
You're not billing me as an expert, are you? Because I mean, clearly, like, what a.
You're an expert. It's fine. You're back. Listen, thank you so much for sharing. And if your computer is done, then we can't get to your files. That's fine. If you want to do it off the top, that's fine. But I also do have some questions and noted a few things.
So you know, thankfully, the PowerPoint was done. I had one more point.
Okay. Do you remember what that one point was?
No, I don't. So it's all good. But I mean, the point that I guess I was trying to emphasize there is simply, I know what it was. I think when we talk about expressing ourselves and when we may be feeling overwhelmed, mm-hmm. I do think that there are times when you may need to go beyond your social circle, beyond your work circle, and perhaps, you know, get some additional professional help. And I urge you to do that. That's not something that I've actually done in terms of my work life. I have sought counseling in my personal life for sure, and I've found it to be very helpful. But if your work organization has an EAP, there is counseling available to you. If there isn't, then do know that at times that you shouldn't suffer in silence. You shouldn't bring it all home to your partner either, and there may be and your family. And there may be times when it's not appropriate to bring it up with your colleagues either. So sometimes professional help may be the way to go, and there's no weakness in that. But at the end of the day, I say all these things just for people to be aware that they do need to take care of themselves, and that's an important part. If we're going to talk about reporting on Indigenous trauma, then taking care of ourselves is as important as the way we take care of our subjects. So that's the final wrap.
The thing that I
you like my new background?
What's that? Oh yeah, it's great.
New background? Yeah.
I love it.
I just like to change it up, you know?
Yeah, I like to change it up. Do you want me to go and run to somebody else's? I'm just joking. Listen, you talk about the care. It is so important. Care is a big word, and I don't think it's doing a lot of heavy lifting. I think it really does matter to care on all counts. And I want to say that I think we all appreciate how much you gave in sharing that last story. The moment with the elders and smudging, it's obviously still with you, Duncan.
Yeah. And again, that just may be a personal thing that the way I have dealt with I don't want to call it compartmentalizing the stories that I hear, but I do tend to go into my head and think about things in a very technical way, as a journalist, about what it's going to take to tell this story in the most effective way. And sometimes I disconnect, you know, from my heart and what it is that I'm experiencing.
Which makes sense. Sometimes we have to, like, our brains, our psyches, it does what it needs to do in order to do the job at hand. And then you were given that moment, or you gave yourself that moment. And I'm glad that you actually did have that moment. Yep. But we're going to get to some of the questions. I'll start off with this one, which is that you made a point of noting that some of the Indigenous journalists who are doing trauma-informed journalism are women. Why is that noteworthy to you?
Oh, I think it's noteworthy to me because, as always, it is the women in our lives who are doing emotional labor. And I just observed that when I started to put together the list of Indigenous journalists who are, and that's not to say that there aren't Indigenous male journalists who are also doing this work. They are, but the ones that are vocalizing it and bringing this discussion out into the open, are primarily female journalists, and I think that's noteworthy. I think that it's important to recognize that that caring is an aspect of the craft. It is, and it has to be. It's not this. We do have a relationship with our subjects. As much as we try to be distanced for good reason, you know, we do stay at distance from our subjects. But caring for your subject is an important part of the relationship.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to read some people's questions now. This is an anonymous question. What are receptive/productive ways of giving feedback to journalists about what I perceive as insensitivities?
So raise them. That's point number one. I mean, I do think that you know, journalism is it's a difficult job, and the general public doesn't always understand the pressures that we're under in terms of the technical pressures, the time pressures, the vast amount of information that we need to sift through, to condense, and to get onto a format that we can share with the country. So, but that said, most journalists that I know would like to be told if there is a concern about their reporting, if there is a concern about their approach, they'd like to know. If only, you know, both to adjust in the story that they're working on and the way that they are treating you, but at the very least, so that they know to get better the next time. So I wouldn't hesitate to, and I think it can be intimidating for a lot of people when a journalist kind of rolls in with a big fancy truck and, you know, saunters out and they're on deadline and things are going fast. You know, again, I emphasize that not all Indigenous people have experience in dealing with journalists, so they may feel intimidated. As a journalist, we need to understand that power imbalance. Mm-hmm. And when someone expresses a concern to you, you should stop and listen and try to explain yourself as best as you can.
Another anonymous question is, when reporting on sensitive or traumatic stories, how can journalists build trust with Indigenous communities in the age of remote reporting?
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, one of the lessons that I put in the guide a long time ago, 10 years ago, was do your reporting in person. You know, it's because when there is a trust gap, when there is distrust between Indigenous communities and journalists, one of the best ways to break down that trust is just go in person. There are a lot of journalists who are afraid to go to the Reds or afraid to go over to that side of town, and would rather work the phones or use emails. And so I urge journalists to get out in person and meet the people that they are hoping to interview. The reality is, during the pandemic, that has not been possible for a lot of us, and it's not easy. Again, I would urge you to do your best to make some sort of connection in the best way that you can, which is, you know, video is better than sending an email, right? I mean, at least I get to see your face and read some of your body language, and just take the time. You know, it's firing off emails and getting angry because Indigenous folks aren't getting back to you by email or on social media. You know, yeah, I mean, Indigenous folks are like everybody else. They're flooded with messages and emails, and you may not be the biggest priority in their lives. So you've got to struggle to try to find some way to make that connection with somebody remotely. And again, that may mean just taking extra time, having one conversation and then two conversations if they have the time. Getting to know somebody is best, building a relationship with them as best as you can over the phone or over video meetings.
Wency's asking, what's the best way to care for your source if they lack community care? What would you do about their story?
That's it's a big question, and I'll tell you this. This isn't the answer that I would have had 15 years ago when I first started out in the business, but now I've changed my tune on this. I am fully prepared to say no. I shouldn't be doing this interview. I should let this interview go.
Mm.
If I think that someone is too raw, if they are too raw and they don't have a support network, then and residential schools are a good example. When the matter of unmarked graves came up last summer, we were racing around yet again trying to find survivors, and there are some survivors who have shared their story and they are confident in the sharing of their story and they have a support network around them. There are others who have never told what happened to them, and you may stumble upon them in the hard work and research that you are doing. But if they don't have somebody in their lives who they can who will be there for them, then maybe you shouldn't be doing an interview with them. Maybe you shouldn't be putting their clips or their quotes in the newspaper.
Mm.
You need to make that, and that you may feel like that's paternalistic, like who am I to judge whether this person, but you need to understand whether or not they understand the line of questioning that you're about to embark upon, whether they understand where their story is going to go, understand what it may trigger, and I say that word trigger again, I mean what it may bring up for them, just the retelling of the story. We have a responsibility, and I'll say this, it's a bit of a legal definition, but we have a duty of care to vulnerable people to make sure that if it may hurt them more by digging into some of the details about the trauma that they experienced, then maybe we should just hold off and just say, you know what, I did a lot of hard work to try to get your phone number and I've got you on the line now, but it doesn't sound like you have anybody in your life who will be there after I hang up the phone. It sounds to me like you may hit the bottle or you may do worse. And I need to be able to sleep at night. I don't want to be responsible for that. And I don't know everything that's going on in the subject's life, the person that I'm phoning, but if I'm starting to get those red flags that they don't have anybody in their life who's going to be able to help take care of them, that's when I start to say, okay, thank you so much for sharing the little information that you did. I think I better, I'm going to think about what you shared with me. It's really helpful in my background research, but I think perhaps maybe it's best that we don't do an interview. I'm going to phone this other number that I got. Try to do it in as respectful way as possible. But if I'm getting those red flags that this person is in pain, is experiencing pain, and has no one to help them with that pain, I'm not that person. I'm not.
But you're saying that you used to be? Are you saying that you like this opinion?
No, when I was a younger journalist, having worked so hard to get this person's phone number, and then I get them on the line, and they answer the phone, and then I record this call? I would have just started firing the questions off and not really, thought as much about the impacts upon the person. I would have taken that consent at that moment and just said, "Bang! I got it. Let's go. Roll." I'm a lot more circumspect.
Yeah. I have a couple of people asking this question about whether these stories should be told by Indigenous reporters, or is it helpful for settlers or others to have a role as well?
So my answer to that is the same as it is when I'm asked this question by journalism students, non-Indigenous journalism students. What role do I have in telling these stories? Do I have any role, if any at all? My answer is yes, absolutely. Non-Indigenous journalists have a role to tell these stories. Yes, we need you to tell these stories. I had a student yesterday who said, what about, what was the phrase? I forget.
Nothing about us.
Nothing about us. Yeah, nothing about us without us. And Naba and I talked about it in her class today. Nothing about us without us. That is an important phrase in the arts community, for example, where we're talking about cultural appropriation. Absolutely, there needs to be in places where Indigenous people have been underrepresented in the storytelling sector, for example, films and books and there's an important argument to be made that Indigenous voices need to be centered and part of the creative process. But if newsrooms are only expecting Indigenous journalists to tell the Indigenous stories, that's not fair to us as Indigenous journalists either. That's putting all of that responsibility on Indigenous journalists to share those stories, when I maybe want to be in Beijing this week. I may want to be covering, I may want to be covering the speed skating oval. I might want to be doing a movie review. My journalistic interests might not always be covering my own Indigenous communities or covering trauma in particular. But I'll also say, we are all treaty peoples, even on unceded lands. I'll use it, that phrase symbolically. We need non-Indigenous journalists to tell these stories, because these are Canadian stories. And if we left it only up to the Indigenous journalists, then we won't be able to get out all of the important stories that need to happen. And does that mean that non-Indigenous journalists should come correct, to use your phrase, Nanaba, that they should have a certain cultural competence before they ever set foot on the res? Yes, absolutely. They need to have a basic understanding of some of our history and culture and our politics. Does it mean that Indigenous journalists may have a certain level of expertise based on our lived experience? Yes, but there's some assumptions about indigeneity there as well. That all Indigenous journalists somehow intimately understand res life, for example. No, they may have grown up in the city, they may be Métis. I don't have any particular expertise in covering Inuit communities. So I do think that at some fundamental level, there will always be outsiders telling Indigenous stories, and that's only practical. If we need to get these stories out, and we're going to need to rely on outsiders to do some of that work.
You know what, it is 5:04, and I think we're going to end with one last question, if that's okay with you.
No problem.
We do have so many other questions. This one is from Heather Kitching. I'm wondering if you can comment on how you feel we can balance forming empathetic, caring, and reciprocal relationships with our sources while dealing with the traditional expectation that we maintain a kind of dispassionate observer's role in our work. Or is it time to straight up push back against that without apology? Also, so many newsrooms are really under-resourced for maintaining relationships that don't produce immediate stories. I'm wondering if you have thoughts or solutions we can offer to management to create that space in our workflow. So there's a lot in there. So yeah. I'll bring it back to the first question. How do we balance the caring with the dispassionate observer role? And do we need to just push back against that?
Well, I talked about rethinking reporting on Indigenous trauma. I think we need to rethink objectivity. I think the whole notion of objectivity, I think, has been poorly misunderstood, or poorly understood, and misunderstood. And I think that the view from nowhere is something that I don't think ever existed, but for all kinds of complicated reasons, journalists have incorporated that into their work for a really long time. I do think it's important that we're not dispassionate, that we tell the communities who we are, where we're from. Where are you from? That's the first thing that any Indigenous person is going to ask you. Where are you from? And they don't really particularly want to know what city you live in. They want to know who your family is.
Who your people are, yeah.
Yeah, who your people are, and what your knowledge is of this place where you come from, so that they can judge. It's a much broader question. Where are you from? Than just wanting to know where you live. And so I think we do need to start pretending that lose this pretension that we are somehow not part of the story. We are very much part of the story, and our unconscious biases are very much part of the story. We should be announcing those things and be aware of them. I do think that we need to be distanced. I also feel that as an Indigenous journalist, I do try to. I am an observer. And I do think that there are truths that are are verifiable, and fact verification is an important part of being a journalist. And so I do try to keep a bit of a distance from my subjects, because you can be blinded if you get in a little bit too deep sometimes. And so I do feel that. I always tell people, that I'm interviewing, I'm not your friend. You know, we may get really intense, build an intense relationship.
Do you say those words?
I do, yeah, I do.
And how do people respond?
Well, I mean, but I really like you, and I really like you too.
Okay.
But I am asking these because I am telling a story.
Right.
I'm a journalist, and you need to understand that relationship that we're in. And you know, Joe and Joyce Pasella, who I started out this talk with, Warriors Against Violence, many years later. This is several years ago that I did that story. But I'm Facebook friends with them, and we ping each other at Christmas. And I just found out some really terrible, awful, tragic news about that happened in their family recently, that they lost a son. And they have a GoFundMe if you happen to can spare a few dollars. You know, it is a relationship that we form with our subjects, but when you asked, when the person asked about the distance, I do feel a little bit that distance is necessary to maintain.
Well, you are playing a role.
Yes.
Right. It is a role that we are playing,
Yeah.
and therefore, like within the job, it has to do with sometimes having that sense. And by the way, every time you do this, I also want to touch your hand.
Yes, there you go.
Yeah, okay, there. But you know what? We're gonna have to end it on that. There's been some lovely flow and care for each other in the comments. You're getting some great comments about, I don't know if you can see them.
No, I can't.
Folks are happy that you're here, and that you've shared so much of yourself. So thank you, everyone who has come here. And I'm sorry to those whose questions didn't get answered, unfortunately. But we will be holding, Carleton does hold these kinds of events every so often. So please continue to follow us. Thank you, everyone. I'm Nanaba, and that was Duncan McCue.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.